Hello, my name's Kevin Alderman. I want to take some time to show you the differences between two organ compositions written by Florence Price. She wrote the sonata, the first sonata for organ, and the suite number one for organ. I had personally mixed them up, which inspired me to start talking about the differences between them. And I was fed by the fact that they're composing completely different periods of her life, almost 25 years apart, right? So there are lots of differences that I'm going to walk you through. And even if you've never heard of these works, I hope you get a chance to listen to them. We're only going to look at excerpts. So starting with the sonata, talking a bit about it on its own. It's called the first sonata for organ, although ironically, she only wrote one sonata for organ, and it's separated into three movements. The introduction, the andantino, and the finale, marked with Roman numerals. It is sonata form, it's a sonata. The second movement it's the easiest to tell that it's distinctly ternary. We see this breakaway towards the B section, a bit of exploration harmonically, and then a return to the recap at the end. It's also heavily imitative. I focus a bit in on the second movements of the sonata and the suite during this because they're so imitative on both sides that it's easiest to compare exactly what differences are made stylistically between these two pieces. And this is important. It's reminiscent of French Romantic organ music, which brings me to my next point. This was essentially written after Alexandre Guillemot's organ sonata in D minor. So when she was 16 years old, she took part in a celebration of Guillemot in New England Conservatory. She played his sonata for him while he was in the audience, and he came up and complimented her himself after the performance. It's not until much later that she composes her own sonata, but the similarities are sort of not up for debate. There's this wonderful preface done by Calvert Johnson, almost comparable in his scholarship of Florence Price as Rayland Brown. But he prefaces it with a very detailed, specific comparison of the sonata and Guillemot's sonata. Right, we don't need to go too into detail because that's not the focus here, but there's a great quote to give you an idea of how he differentiates them. Both begin by featuring massive chords and dotted rhythms and conclude the introduction with the same harmonic progression, Neapolitan with pedal arpeggios leading to the dominant with the third in the treble. So like I said, this isn't really an influence as much as it is an obvious derivation, which points out that this is undoubtedly a student piece, right? Nothing is certain about it, but she was practicing or studying composition under Wesley LaViolette, a Chicago Musical College, when she was writing this piece. Having that combined with having played the sonata, it's almost certainly meant to be a rehashing of Guillemot's sonata. Now talking a little bit more about the suite. The suite is separated into four movements, also ironically called suite number one, even though it's the only suite that she wrote for organ. Those four movements, it's separated into the fantasy, fuguetta, air, and toccato. We're going to talk about the differences between them more in depth, but in general, the latter three movements are using a lot of pentatonics and a lot of Negro spiritual references. The fantasy is generally more virtuosic than anything we see in the sonata. She composed this shortly after she composed her Symphony No. 3 in C minor. Now, she made comments on the symphony, very specific comments about what she was thinking when she was composing this symphony, and because she composed the suite so recently after, we can very quickly apply these comments to how she might have composed the suite. Here's the quote with a bit taken out. It is intended to be Negroid in character and expression. In it, no attempt, however, has been made to project Negro music solely in the purely traditional manner. None of these themes are adaptations or derivations of folk songs. The other two movements, the first and the last, are meant to follow conventional lines of form and development. Part of what I get from that is that this is based around spirituals, not traditional folk music. Right, and those are different genres, and it's important that we make that distinction. The last three movements recall Negro spirituals, and like I said, I mentioned specifically here the toccato, but the last three movements, all three of them heavily use pentatonics. So let's talk about a general comparison before we get into more specific differences between these two compositions. The sonata was composed in 27, the suite was composed in 42, which puts them, I don't want to mess up the math on video, 15 years apart. Right? The sonata was modeled after a specific composition. That's a huge difference. I'm not saying we should totally discount how she was composing based on the fact that she was composing modeled after Guillemot. We still see quite a bit of her voice in her composition of this sonata, especially in the second movement, where it is most different from anything that Guillemot wrote in his sonata. Complexity is a big thing, and I know it's a general label, but I will get into the specificity of it. Imitation versus counterpoint. Again, I'm gonna hone in on the second movements here, but in the second movement we see a lot of homophony, even though we have imitation. In fact, it's verbatim imitation. It's canonic. It comes from the theme. The theme comes back in the dominant key, exactly transposed, but still every eighth note is very clearly aligned, and you can do a harmonic analysis per eighth note. That doesn't apply so much when we get into the fuguetta, which has independent voices, independent lines, which we'll talk about more in detail in a second. Virtuosity is a big deal. Having tried the sonata, having tried the suite and having played the sonata, the suite is substantially more difficult. The sonata is readable. The suite needs to be learned and practiced. And that's, at the risk of sounding pretentious, I come from a place where I can read a certain level of music. All this to say, from experience, the suite is much harder to play than the sonata. And we see that especially in the pedal lines, which I'll talk about also in detail. And then the chromaticism. Token chromaticism is something I'm going to say a few times. And by that I mean this sort of throwing in an excerpt or a couple bars of chromaticism in the sonata just to sort of have a little bit of contrast and to show that she can compose, I suppose, in a different style, compared to the suite where it is integrated into the primary thematic material. And it causes these very dense sections of counterpoint, especially towards the middle of the fuguetta. Similar length, they're both her longest organ compositions. They hover around 20 minutes, I think, each, and nothing else compares. She wrote quite a bit of short music, and then these are multi-movement, groups of small pieces. Negroid in character, it's hard to perfectly decipher what she meant, but the usage of pentatonics is present in both, albeit much more in the suite. And plagal cadences happen quite a bit, which makes sense coming out of this sort of church performance, congregational singing. Now the fuguetta versus the andantino. Fugues are totally unique, granted, right? And they follow a strict set of rules, but similar contrapuntal textures in the second movements, as in they're both imitative. Again, the suite is much more dense, but imitation helps to see how she's lining up these progressions and these cadences. Her articulation and introduction of thematic material, or in the fugue's case, subjects, is similar, right? So she tends to back away and ask for decrescendos into the introduction of the next subject or the next iteration of the theme, which is sort of counterintuitive to when we're playing Bach on the organ and we want to emphasize and really point out when a subject is entering. And the meter is almost identical, right? They're imitative, but they're in a dance meter, sort of like the jig fugue. They're 6/8 and 3/4. Now complexity we can talk a bit about more in detail. Again, imitation versus counterpoint. In the andantino, we really see you can do a harmonic analysis per eighth note. And then going to the fuguetta of the suite, it's they're independent ideas. And it's really hard to tell at any given point what exactly the harmony is, especially with the chromaticism. And virtuosity, I'm going to point out the pedal lines in just a second, but there are also 3 scalar passages in the fantasy, the first movement. 3 times it's this sort of flourish up the keyboard that we really don't have the technical demand for in the sonata. Again, partly because it's inspired by Guillemot, and he was asking for this very broad chordal texture throughout the introduction, compared to the very different genre of a fantasy. Specificity and registration. It's a difference, but it doesn't necessarily refer to complexity. In the sonata, she's very specific about what she wants at the beginning of each movement of the sonata. But once it begins, it really leaves it up to the performer as to what changes they want to make. In contrast to the suite, where there is no registration information, we have to rely on the preface by Calvert Johnson to go off of registrations and what she was playing. But within the movement, interestingly, she tells us to pull stops or put stops away to change the dynamics via the registration of the organ throughout the piece. So despite the fact that she never gave us what she wants at the beginning, she'll tell us a page or so into the piece, put away the great coupler, don't couple these keyboards together, make it quieter. And the pedal demands, I'll show you right now. This is the pedal line, and I apologize, a lot of these are scans of my score because the score isn't easy to get a hold of, so you'll see my footings and my markings. This is as complex as the pedal line gets throughout the sonata. It's from the Andantino, the slow movement, but even including the introduction, this is as complicated as it gets. That being said, I still needed to mark in my footings. It's not easy to play, but it's the rhythm is very straightforward, eighth notes and quarter notes with one dotted quarter note. And you can hear what this sounds like. Played on a piano, unfortunately, not on an organ pedal board, mostly so that you can hear a bit more clearly what's happening. Right, very relaxed. It's not hard to play. You could give it to a very early student. Compared to this is a pedal line that is not isolated. This is not a pedal solo. It is part of the texture, which you'll see in a second, and much harder to play. Just from the rhythm alone, the compound meter and the offset 16th notes. Listen to how this sounds in contrast. That's on the upper end of difficulty in terms of pedal motifs in the organ repertoire. We can shift away from the complexity and talk a little bit about that chromaticism now. As I said, the chromatic motifs are few and far between in the sonata, so it's really just sort of thrown in occasionally for this exciting sort of break completely away from the tonal language that she's set up. The suite, it's built in. It's in the thematic material. You'll see that in the excerpt at the end. And one thing that I really like she does is she transitions really smoothly from very heavily chromatic, occasionally almost serialist sounding motifs to this neoclassical, neo-romantic, going back into a perfect authentic cadence, which you'll also see a bit of. So you see immediately that pedal line, the third clef down from the top, that is the pedal line I showed you earlier. It is played in addition to what's happening in the keyboards, the manuals above. Right, so I'm going to play this for you. I don't play this piece, and I haven't practiced it, but I think I played it well enough that you can get an idea for the chromaticism that's really integrated into this texture. I had to go on just a little bit so that you could hear that cadence at the end. There weren't many satisfying places to stop. Contrast this with, you'll see 44, 45, and 46 are this sort of thrown in chromaticism. And this is the only spot that this happens in the Andantino, as in this sort of token chromaticism. Otherwise, it stays pretty strictly typical 1 4 5 1 1 2 6 4, right? And you see it jump right back to that sort of harmonic structure at 47. And back into that thematic material. And the last big thing that I want to bring up is the usage of pentatonic scales. It happens quite a bit in both, but again, it's much, much more in the suite. And that's what these last examples are for, not just so you can get a general idea of how the two compositions sound, but also so you can really see that pentatonic usage. Last three movements use it. The sonata, it's limited to the andantino, again, because she based this work around Guillemot's sonata, and Guillemot was composing in a very strict French Romantic style, and so it makes sense that we'd see the most Negro spiritual sounding music in the movement that she deviated most from Guillemot's example. Again, just like with the chromaticism, she transitions very smoothly between pentatonics and classical, partly progressions, but mostly cadences. You'll hear that in a second. And this could be unique to these two pieces, or it could be a tenet of her compositional style, but they're often used imitatively. Pentatonic scales fit very well together, and she uses them in the fuguetta, the andantino, and in the air, she combines them quite a bit, and you hear it call and response between the voices. So this is the opening of the andantino, the second movement of the sonata for organ, and you're definitely going to hear it in the theme. Let me play it for you first, and talk about it in a second. And it goes on to be, again, a perfectly transposed iteration. The next page or so is sort of a two-part counterpoint, and it transitions to this more homophonic texture, as we saw earlier. And then with this sort of out of place is a dangerous thing to say, but unexpected chromaticism in the middle. And again, the whole movement is ternary. Now, here's the chromaticism the usage of pentatonics in her fuguetta. This is the theme of the fuguetta right from the beginning. Right, and that chromaticism you hear towards the second half very quickly explains why you have such a dense chromatic section towards the second half of the fuguetta, which is the excerpt I took earlier and showed you the more complicated pedal part 2. This is the air. Again, I'd absolutely encourage you to listen to the suite. On Spotify, there are 2 movements available of the suite, but on SoundCloud, I'm sure that there's a recording of someone else playing. We know the sonata is on SoundCloud. There's a wonderful recording of it there. But just to show you an excerpt of the air and hear the pentatonics, it's in the top voice. You can see. Right. Again, she has this sort of counterintuitive, she decrescendos into the introduction of thematic material and crescendos towards the end of phrases, often like this, into the fermata. Last but not least, this is the beginning of the final movement of her suite. Also, very easy to recognize aurally. So to summarize the differences between the first sonata organ and suite number 1 for organ. 3 movements versus 4 movements, introduction, andantino, and finale, because Guillemot's sonata was 3 movements, and suite number 1 for organ, which is 4 smaller pieces rather than 3 movements, is a better way to think of it. Fantasie, Fugetta, Air, and Toccata, as she wrote it, not toccata. Based around Guillemot's style, the French Romantic style, of course, it's derivative of that sonata. And the suite number 1 was composed much later, after Symphony number 3. The sonata is a sonata. It's in sonata form, and the second movement is the most obvious place to recognize that ternary form. The andantino stands out in that sonata as being most different from Guillemot's sonata. You see most of her personal compositional choices in the andantino as compared to the other movements, which are really rehashings of the sonata that Guillemot wrote. And then the 3 big big changes after 15 years of composition that we see in her suite number 1 is pentatonic scales. It's not it's built in to 3 out of the 4 movements, not just in the second movement. The chromaticism is integrated so deeply, not just placed. Not arbitrarily, but placed in isolation. It could be totally removed from the texture. And the virtuosity. The suite is a significantly more difficult piece. We see that in the pedal. We see that in the density of the contrapuntal texture. And otherwise, as I thought that they were very similar pieces and I mixed them up, they're entirely different for a variety of reasons. And it's really incredible how much her style changed just after 15 years. You could easily think that these were composed by different composers. I hope you get a chance to listen to both of these pieces. They're outstanding organ works. I'm happy that they're in the repertoire. I'm happy they're being brought to light. Otherwise, thank you for listening to my presentation.